when the relations of the United States and the Soviet Union were at an all frozen in the 1980s, there was no way of knowing what kind of exotic threat was about to roar through the Iron Curtain in Russia. That's where the Defense Intelligence Agency entered. This intelligence agency low profile of the response of the Department of Defense, the CIA worked day and night to discover new Soviet military threats and report to Washington. Because the top-secret nature of these issues, the agency employs a team of artists to create highly accurate representations of each threat, for use in meetings and publishing policies via as Soviet military power. These themes were so top-secret that own representations were considered classified material. Between 1965 and 1989, the DIA artists created more than 1,000 paintings and drawings of Soviet threats, now known as the Collection of Military Art DIA. Here are 10 of the most intimidating weapons we thought the Soviets were developing. Soviet Strategic Defenses based on the space by Ronald C. Whitman, 1987. The fact that the Soviets publicly opposed the Strategic Defense Initiative of President Reagan, also known as Star Wars, does not mean they were not feverishly working on its own version. Strategic defenses based on the Soviet space were part of a unified land, air shield, and spatial ballistic missile Moscow. Ray Space Particles Ronald C. Whitman, 1987. Instead of trying to hit a small satellite, just looked at thousands of miles per hour, kilometers above a ground-based laser. Why not send another satellite to shoot from the sky? The Soviets explored the idea of satellites under murderers armed with particle beam weapons and kinetic-based laser through the 1980s. Neither of the technologies were ever released, anyway. Soviet Mi-24 Hind Spray Chemical Dispersant by Edward L. Cooper, 1986. The Mi-24 Hind is scary enough on its own. But when equipped with POD's chemical dispersion, these heavy assault helicopters could quickly cut the death of powder on a huge battlefield or metropolitan area. Not that the Soviets were running short with chemical weapons. The Soviet Union maintained such a deadly deal, Syria would seem reserves and Altoids tin. Terribly, each weapon system long mid-range and in the Soviet arsenal could be rearranged for chemical warfare. Soviet Space Station and Shuttle by Brian W. McMillan, 1986, in what could have been a hit counter equivalent to the United States landing on the moon and a devastating blow to American pride. Both the USSR planned to create a permanent space station in Earth orbit and reusable transport ship for service. Thank the sweet baby Jesus and Reagan that this techno-political catastrophe never happened in reality. Soviet aircraft wings with ground effects Brian W. McMillan, 1988, by exploiting what is known as ground effect, in which the wings generate extra lift and less drag when flying near a flat surface, such as the ground or water surface. Soviet researchers hoped to develop class sizes larger ground effect vehicles, such as Orlan top-class coastal defense and amphibious assaults. Base Soviet ballistic missiles submarines Brian W. McMillan, 1986. The Arctic Circle hosted a series of strategic battles between East and West during the Cold War. At one point, the USSR considered the deployment of strategic ballistic missiles submarines of Typhoon and Delta IV there, using tunnels dug into the hillside to provide the most advanced nuclear submarines in the Russian Navy plenty of protection against break. Unfortunately, did not have Americans sending Clint Eastwood to steal your supersonic spy plane. Mobile Laser Defense of Soviet Airfields by Edward L. Cooper, 1987. Since lasers were clearly Russia's answer to everything in the 1980s, Soviet researchers examined the potential use of technology in the defense of airfields. These truck-mounted not only would block the incoming pilots as modern portable lasers, but the fuselage would melt and leave the plane on fire. The technology makes it very far through prototype and testing process, to the point that many analysts expected at the time of the USSR to deploy actually a model ready for production in the next decade. Fortunately, the Soviets had no idea how the economy works, and the whole system collapsed on itself before moving lasers could be used. ABM Pushenko by Ronald C. Whitman, 1983. The Soviet Yin-Yang against Atlas America. Pushenko ABM anti-ballistic missile was the first of its kind and the only operational. The ABM missiles are specifically designed to intercept ballistic missiles' multiple warheads intercontinental entrees. The Soviet system was installed on the outskirts of Moscow in the 1970s, but a decade later, has been updated with the Gazelle interceptor missile-based nuclear silo and largest radar to better control and command the ABM, and flying towards their goals. Cosmos 389 Element by Brian W. McMillan, 1982. The space became a battleground between the United States and the Soviet Union long before Reagan launched the idea of Star Wars. In early 1970, Russia launched the Cosmos 389, the first of what became known as satellites. These small spacecraft blocked radar emissions and radio could identify the United States sites' air defense and command centers, a blessing for the Soviet intelligence. Soviet ground-based laser by Edward L. Cooper, 1986. During the 1980s, the Soviet Strategic Defense Program invested heavily in terrestrial fixed lasers capable of attacking satellites. And while the United States intelligence argued that sites like the Terra-3 in Kazakhstan showed the existence of the GAP laser, Soviet technology never came to fruition. Some prototypes were tested modest, however. The rest of these fascinating paintings can be seen on the 4th floor of the museum area in DIAC in Washington, D.C., and the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum.